The U.S. Court of Appeals has delivered a significant decision that is already being described as one of the most impactful trade rulings in recent years. The judges declared that former President Donald Trump's global tariffs, which were imposed during his administration, were unlawful. These tariffs were far-reaching, covering a vast array of imported goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Trump had justified the sweeping economic measures under the claim of protecting national security and defending American industries from what he described as unfair foreign competition. Steel and aluminum imports were among the first to be targeted, with Trump arguing that foreign dumping of cheap metals weakened America's ability to defend itself in times of conflict. Over time, however, his administration expanded the list of targeted products, hitting imports from Europe, China, and many other regions. The court, however, ruled that the administration had gone beyond its lawful authority, stretching the definition of national security to cover areas that had little or no direct connection to genuine defense concerns. The judges emphasized that the laws under which these tariffs were enacted gave presidents limited emergency powers, but those powers could not be used to rewrite trade policy entirely without congressional involvement. The ruling carries deep implications, not only for the legacy of Trump's presidency but also for the future of how trade policy is managed in the United States. For years, business groups, lawmakers, and foreign governments had argued that the tariffs were more about politics than about actual national security. By striking down the legality of the tariffs, the court has raised questions about accountability, separation of powers, and the ability of a president to act unilaterally in the economic sphere. The decision has unsettled Washington and sparked debate among policymakers about how far executive authority should stretch when it comes to matters of international commerce. For many in the business world, the announcement was met with relief, though it also introduced uncertainty about what happens next. Companies that had struggled with higher costs due to the tariffs are hopeful that this decision could pave the way toward easing trade barriers and reducing expenses. On the other hand, industries that benefited from protectionist measures are nervous about what this means for their survival. The tariffs at the center of this ruling had a profound impact during the Trump years. Initially, Trump's administration portrayed them as a bold move to defend American jobs, particularly in sectors like steel, aluminum, and heavy manufacturing. The White House insisted that foreign producers were undercutting U.S. markets by flooding them with cheap goods, leaving domestic workers and companies at risk. The tariffs, which applied broadly to imports from China, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and several other trading partners, were pitched as a way to bring balance and force foreign nations to negotiate fairer trade terms. But the sweeping measures quickly drew sharp criticism. Opponents claimed they were a blunt economic weapon that did more harm than good. Farmers in the Midwest, for example, found themselves facing retaliatory tariffs from China and Europe, which cut into their agricultural exports. Manufacturers that depended on imported materials complained that their costs had soared, making it harder for them to compete globally. Economists warned that consumers, too, were paying the price as higher tariffs translated into higher prices for everyday goods, from cars to electronics. The court's decision now opens the door for industries and trade groups that suffered under these policies to challenge them and possibly seek compensation. Critics of Trump's trade agenda argue that the tariffs undermined long-standing alliances, damaged trust in global trade systems, and put American businesses at a disadvantage. The ruling represents a vindication for those who argued all along that the administration had abused its power and stretched the law beyond recognition. At the same time, it marks a turning point in the debate over protectionism versus free trade. Trump and his supporters insist that the tariffs were necessary to push back against countries like China, which they accuse of manipulating trade rules and exploiting U.S. markets. Yet the judges were clear that even if the motivations were rooted in real economic challenges, the methods chosen were unlawful. For Trump's opponents, the ruling is evidence that his administration bypassed the checks and balances designed to prevent the misuse of executive authority. For his supporters, however, it may become a rallying cry. Another example they see is the establishment undermining his America First policies. The tariffs that became the subject of such intense controversy during the Trump administration were initially introduced with the promise of protecting American workers and industries, but in practice they ended up reshaping the economic landscape in unpredictable ways. Steel and aluminum were the first targets, with the White House arguing that dependence on foreign metals placed the United States at a strategic disadvantage. From there, the administration broadened its measures, applying tariffs to a wide range of products from China, Europe, Canada, and beyond. Trump defended the moves as essential to reducing trade deficits and reviving U.S. manufacturing, often presenting the policy as a form of economic nationalism. Yet as months passed, it became increasingly clear that the tariffs were functioning less as a precise policy tool and more as a blunt instrument that affected almost every corner of the economy. Foreign nations retaliated with their own tariffs, targeting iconic American exports such as soybeans, corn, whiskey, and motorcycles. This retaliation created ripple effects that left farmers struggling to find international markets, forcing the U.S. government to spend billions in subsidies just to keep parts of the agricultural sector afloat. Manufacturers also felt the sting. Many American businesses relied heavily on imported materials that suddenly became more expensive. For example, car manufacturers saw the cost of essential metals increase dramatically, raising production expenses and cutting into profits. Smaller companies, which lacked the resources to absorb higher input costs, often had no choice but to pass those expenses on to consumers, resulting in higher prices for everyday goods. Critics of the tariffs argued that the strategy amounted to a hidden tax on American families, disproportionately affecting middle and lower-income households who had to spend more for products ranging from washing machines to cars. On the international stage, Trump's tariffs strained relations with long-standing allies. European countries were particularly angered, arguing that it was unreasonable to treat their industries as threats to American national security. Diplomatic tensions grew, and instead of pushing foreign governments to make concessions, many dug in their heels, escalating the conflict. What was intended to strengthen America's position in the world trade system ended up fueling skepticism about U.S. leadership. The court's ruling that these tariffs were illegal has now reopened many of these old wounds. Industries that were forced to navigate volatile markets during the trade wars are considering fresh legal action, hoping the decision provides a pathway to recovering losses. Farmers, manufacturers, and retailers that bore the brunt of the economic fallout may attempt to push for compensation or for a rapid rollback of remaining tariffs. The decision has also emboldened critics who long argued that the tariffs were less about national security and more about political theater. To them, the ruling is a formal recognition that the Trump administration went too far in its interpretation of executive power, and that the costs of that decision were carried by ordinary Americans. At the same time, the legal consequences of the ruling extend beyond immediate economic relief. Experts point out that the decision could set a lasting precedent that reshapes how future administrations use tariff authority. For decades, presidents have relied on national security arguments to justify quick, decisive trade restrictions. The Trump administration, however, stretched that justification further than ever before, applying it to products and industries that many observers believed had no genuine connection to defense concerns. The court made it clear that while presidents do have authority to act in emergencies, they cannot unilaterally remake trade policy without meaningful checks from Congress. This reassertion of constitutional balance could have far-reaching implications. If the ruling stands, it will likely constrain how much power future presidents can claim when it comes to trade disputes. For Congress, this is an opportunity to reclaim a more central role in shaping U.S. trade policy. Lawmakers from both parties have long complained that successive presidents, not just Trump, have accumulated too much influence over international commerce, often leaving legislators sidelined. By reinforcing limits on executive action, the court has effectively signaled that trade policy must return to being a shared responsibility. This could mean that future debates over tariffs and trade restrictions will involve more negotiation and compromise in Congress, rather than unilateral decisions from the White House. Some economists welcome this change, arguing that it could bring more predictability and stability to U.S. trade relations, which in turn would benefit global markets. However, the decision also raises new questions. If presidents can no longer rely on broad national security justifications, will the United States be too slow to respond to genuine trade threats? What happens in cases where rapid action is needed to counter practices like currency manipulation, cyber theft, or intellectual property violations? The ruling leaves room for interpretation, but it is clear that any future administration will need to tread more carefully when invoking emergency powers for economic measures. Supporters of Trump warn that this could tie the hands of future leaders, weakening America's leverage in negotiations with countries like China. Opponents counter that the United States can still act firmly, but must do so in a way that respects the limits of law and balances of power. Internationally, the ruling against Trump's global tariffs has been received with a mix of relief, vindication, and cautious optimism. Countries that were directly targeted by the tariffs, particularly China and the European Union, have taken note of the court's decision as a symbolic victory. For years, these governments had argued that the United States was misusing the banner of national security to justify protectionism, undermining the very rules of the global trading system that Washington had once championed. The court's decision now gives weight to their arguments, suggesting that even within the U.S. system of governance, Trump's actions exceeded lawful authority. For allies in Europe, this development is not just a legal issue but also a diplomatic opening. European officials had long sought to de-escalate the trade tensions that arose during Trump's presidency, which strained transatlantic partnerships at a time when cooperation was needed on broader global challenges. With the tariffs now declared unlawful, the European Union may push for renewed talks on a more stable, rules-based trading relationship, hoping to avoid the unpredictability that marked the Trump years. For China, the ruling carries a different but equally important meaning. Trump had made his trade war with China a centerpiece of his economic agenda, imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. Beijing retaliated with tariffs of its own, targeting key American exports, from agricultural products to industrial goods. The back-and-forth escalated tensions, disrupted supply chains, and affected global markets. Now, the U.S. court's rejection of the legality of Trump's tariffs gives China an opportunity to portray itself as the more consistent player in trade, pointing to the instability within the American system as a liability. Yet even with this diplomatic advantage, Beijing remains wary. While the ruling undermines Trump's approach, it does not guarantee that future administrations will abandon aggressive trade tactics. Both Democrats and Republicans have expressed skepticism toward free trade in recent years, and China knows that U.S. frustrations with its economic practices, ranging from intellectual property theft to state subsidies, are not limited to one president. Other nations, too, are watching closely. Canada and Mexico, which were also caught in the crossfire of Trump's tariffs, see the ruling as a chance to strengthen North American cooperation. Developing economies that rely on exports to the United States are hopeful that this signals a shift toward more predictable trade conditions. Still, the mood is cautious. International partners have witnessed how quickly U.S. trade policy can swing from one extreme to another, depending on the political winds in Washington. As much as the ruling provides relief, it also reinforces the perception that America has become an unpredictable actor in global commerce. Many countries may respond by diversifying their trade partnerships further, reducing reliance on the U.S. market to guard against sudden policy reversals in the future. For Donald Trump, the court's ruling represents another heavy blow, both legally and politically. As he campaigns for a possible return to the White House, this decision cuts directly into one of the signature policies of his presidency. Trump had long touted his tariffs as proof that he was willing to stand up to China, protect American workers, and prioritize national interests over globalist trade deals. The court's decision, however, reframes those tariffs as unlawful overreach, undermining one of the central narratives of his leadership. His supporters are already framing the ruling as part of a broader pattern of establishment resistance, claiming that the political and legal system is determined to dismantle his achievements and weaken his America First agenda. This narrative may resonate with his base, who view such setbacks not as failures but as proof that Trump is fighting entrenched interests on their behalf. On the other side, Trump's opponents are seizing on the ruling as evidence that his approach to governance was reckless and unlawful. For them, this decision reinforces the argument that Trump's presidency was characterized by a willingness to bypass legal constraints and established norms, often leaving chaos in his wake. They argue that the tariffs not only failed to achieve their goals but also inflicted lasting damage on American businesses, farmers, and consumers. The political conversation is now shifting to how much responsibility Trump should bear for those economic disruptions and whether voters will hold him accountable as he seeks a return to power. The ruling also raises broader questions about Trump's legacy. Trade was one of the areas where he most visibly broke with the traditional Republican platform, steering the party away from its free market stance and toward a protectionist, populist agenda. The court's rejection of his tariff policy forces a re-evaluation of that shift. Will the Republican Party continue down the path Trump charted, or will it seek a new balance between economic nationalism and global engagement? For Democrats, the ruling provides ammunition in arguing for a more rules-based, multilateral approach to trade, but they, too, face the challenge of reconciling voter skepticism toward globalization with the demands of international cooperation. The ultimate impact of the decision will likely unfold over years, as courts, policymakers, and businesses adapt. For now, the ruling stands as a defining moment in the legal and political battle over Trump's legacy. It not only invalidates one of his most high-profile policies but also forces a deeper reckoning about the balance of power in American governance, the role of the courts in checking executive authority, and the future direction of U.S. trade policy. Whether it becomes a turning point toward greater stability or simply another chapter in the cycle of American unpredictability remains to be seen.